Hello, and welcome to the closing session in our Nobel Prize Inspiration Initiative events in Austin. Over the last 2 days, our three visiting Nobel laureates, Liz Blackburn, Bob Grubbs, and Andy Fire, have been very busy. They've joined panel discussions, they've had roundtable discussions with students, they've been part of poster presentations, they've met high school and middle school students from the Austin Independent School District. And for this closing discussion, we thought we'd focus on an aspect of all those conversations that has perhaps been assumed but not explicitly discussed, which is the value of science. And for this discussion, I'm very pleased to say that we're being joined by one of UT Austin's own Nobel laureates, Stephen Weinberg, who of course received the 1979 prize in physics. Stephen Weinberg, hello. So, let me start with you, Liz. When people talk about the value of science, they think perhaps of applications. At the moment, science's currency is perhaps quite high, given that people are expecting and hoping that science will put an end to the pandemic, that it'll help tackle the problems of climate change. But when the phrase "the value of science" is used, what does it conjure up for you?
Well, it certainly conjures up what you just said, but I'd like to add something else, which we talk about less, and that's how much science enriches us all by bringing us the beauty and wonder of the universe and life in all sorts of different forms. I'll just take a couple of examples. I can think of the beauty of the telescopic images of the swirling galaxies of the universe and the visual message that they give us of the extraordinary complexity and interest of the universe and our place in it. And just going closer to our planet Earth, what about thinking about life? I think there's great beauty and elegance in the fact that it's just 4 different DNA nucleotide building blocks that make patterns that produce the genetic information that underlies the myriad forms of life on the planet and which underlies how we work. So I think we can add to the sometimes more utilitarian value of science. We can add that it really is something that makes all of our lives richer by bringing to us things that we wouldn't have thought about or known about had it not been for science.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me go through all of you and ask the same question, and then we'll move into a discussion. So, Stephen Weinberg, what does the value of science mean to you?
Well, certainly it has the values that you and Dr. Blackburn have already mentioned, that science provides a font of information that allows us to do wonderful things technologically, medically, and so on. Also, the world is a beautiful place. Whether it's looking outward at a galaxy or inward at a living cell, the world, I think as somewhere in Lewis Carroll, the world is full of a number of things. I'm sure we should all be as happy as kings. But I think one could be a little bit more specific. The world as revealed by science is a world governed by law, and it's impersonal law. It's not law that we make. It's out there. We do our best to formulate it in equations. We think we're getting closer and closer to a more fundamental understanding. But this is an ancient aspect of the value of science. About 100 years before the time of Socrates, Democritus speculated about atoms without having much reason for the speculation. And his speculations were seized on by Epicurus and then in a great poem by Lucretius, not because they were convinced of the existence of atoms, but because this kind of impersonal description of nature, atoms and the void, as they said, provided a way for human beings to be not afraid of the gods. Indeed, it's been said that when in Britain in the 18th century, people stopped burning witches, it was partly a consequence of the development of Newtonian astronomy in the 17th century that revealed what kind of a world this is. So I think that's, in a way, the greatest value of science is to tell us the kind of world we're in.
Tell us the kind of world we're in, but not with complete certainty, because there's always behind that method the freedom to doubt, as Feynman called it, for instance.
Well, we're certainly not. I've made terrible mistakes myself in physics. The wonderful thing is that the methods of science are sufficiently well developed so that even the people who make the mistakes can be convinced that they've made a mistake. You don't find that very often in politics or religion.
Thank you. So, Bob, please, same question to you.
Yeah, so I'm a chemist, and we look at things in sort of solid terms and real terms, and so the first thing I think of course, is the value of science and all the applications it has and all the things it can do, and we can do what we're doing right now because of science and because of the background of everything that's happened there, and that's wonderful. The other part of it is that the value of science, which reminds me, back when I was a student and Sputnik went up, and sort of the wonders and joys of that, and the scary part of that, and how that actually changed how science happened in the U.S. and how it actually changed my career, for example, because it opened up many opportunities. So there's that whole part of it. There's the other part of it too, which is what's always fascinated me, which is sort of the intellectual construct that we make to try to understand the world and try to understand how we're doing, and sort of the beauty of that, and how we can sort of set and draw a few little structures on a piece of paper and actually go in the lab and make them and understand how to go from here to there, and that's also incredibly pleasing. And the other part of it too, which I think is really an important aspect of science, which is the social aspect. So the value of getting scientists together to talk, to think, to dream, to put stuff together, and so I think we shouldn't forget the social aspect of it, which we've missed a bit this year, but it's always been really important to me of having a group of friends around the world, and also having it basically goes cross borders and everything, and so I was involved in the early days of interactions with Soviet scientists when things hadn't opened up then. And so I think it opens up a whole social world, which is outside of politics and religion, which is much easier to deal with.
Yes, the practice of science is basically the opposite of the kind of image of the crazy scientist in the lab coat with the weird hair standing alone in the lab and not meeting anyone.
Yes, right. Yep.
Andy.
So, I mean, as any good scientist would do, I'll start by not answering the question. So, I mean, I think when someone says the value of science, I start thinking of the values of science and what we value, and what we value specifically in science would be, at the very top, probably truth, and answers that, at least to our current state of knowledge, model the universe and are consistent with that. But just below that is the value for uncertainty. And the importance that we really value the uncertainties in the universe, because that's what we do. That's what drives us forward. And finally, curiosity of wanting to know what's there. And the other thing is that scientists all bring to science their own values. What they think is important, not driven from science, but driven from their history as human beings and their families and their view of the world. And so that's another thing that's a part of science. Then you get to the value of science, and it's the same thing. It's truth. We provide the world with truth that can be used to make change, to sustain humankind, and to move forward. We provide the world with uncertainty also. That's very important. If we communicate what we're uncertain about, that's very important to the greater community. And we provide the world with curiosity. It's it's the curiosity, the nature of science, the beauty of science, as really it was described. Those are things that we actually provide the world. And then finally, the values that come from science are not so much the values that science put into it, but the values that the world then does in using what science comes out. I think there's a great responsibility. There could be value in science that for somebody is not value for somebody else. None of us really want to make bombs. None of us want to make weapons. And yet there is that value to science that to some extent as scientists we're responsible for at least explaining the consequences of. But there are many positive values that science provides as well. And so those positive values are things that again we can help the public with. We can communicate with the public to make sure that those come out. And perhaps that some of the negative values of science that could be there are not things that come to pass that are made concrete.
Thank you very much. All four of you together have beautifully summarized a raft of different values and weave them together. I want to just start by focusing on that word responsibility. You all understand what science means, obviously very deeply, but the responsibility to communicate that to people and to try and get some of this across is not straightforward. I mean, for instance, when it comes to uncertainty, people often look to scientists for certainty, even though perhaps they shouldn't be, and they worry when doubt is raised. I mean, for instance, we're seeing it now with vaccines. You all know that it's quite reasonable that there's doubt about these things, but perhaps not everybody does. So I'd like to ask, how do you tackle that responsibility to talk to people and to get the message across? Who would like to tackle that? Stephen, what would you like to?
I think one simply has to be honest. There are places where one is uncertain. I think one of the reasons that Dr. Fauci has become such a heroic symbol is because he does admit from time to time in his press conferences things that we don't yet know, as compared with blustering politicians who are certain in everything they say. On the other hand, there are things we're certain about, and we shouldn't lie about that either. This ridiculous argument about whether or not children should be exposed to both sides in the debate over evolution, as if that is an uncertain matter. A friend of mine satirized this by forming an organization to advocate teaching both sides of the issue of whether the world is flat. And he thought that students, clearly this is a joke, students ought to be exposed to both sides of the issue of whether or not the earth is flat or a sphere. Well, we don't expose our students to both sides of that issue. We know damn well it's a sphere. And similarly, we know damn well that living beings are what they are because of billions of years of evolution proceeding through random mutations and with natural selection occurring through breedings and eatings. We should not, I think, hide our uncertainties, nor should we hide our certainties.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in?
I would start up. I don't know if we have room for a debate and time for a debate, but is it the end of the world to expose students to arguments that are flawed, perhaps, as I had experience with not quite the flat Earth argument as a high school student, but high school science teacher who brought in somebody with a pretty outrageous scientific argument. I learned a ton from that discussion. I learned about how science is communicated. I learned how to look at a scientific argument, which the person was trying to make for the equivalent of a flat Earth thing, and to look at that and be skeptical of it. And that was a tremendous guide to science, to being a scientist and to being in a community. So I do think we shouldn't hide the different kinds of opinions that come out, the different kinds of scientific arguments in educating students, we should probably educate them in how to evaluate them. It doesn't mean that we have an entire curriculum on the flat Earth, but I think that it isn't ridiculous to say, okay, well, how would you determine this? And this is I was reminded of this recently, because that's a course that I think a very good professor at one of a very unusual college was teaching a course on the flat Earth to students as a way to first prove that the Earth isn't flat. That's a good starting point for that, and then look at why some people believe that it is. It's a great kind of training exercise to do. So I wouldn't say the entire curriculum should be that, but I don't know that we should hide the fact that some people believe differently.
Well, I suspect that you very quickly realized that this outsider who was brought into your classroom was spouting nonsense, and it did you no lasting harm. I think when you're talking about an issue that's much more in the public eye, like evolution, where there are religious reverberations, that can be a real disservice to students. But in a way, you've mentioned in passing what I think is a way of providing just the kind of perspective that you're seeking, and that is the history of science. When you read the history of science, as you described, the history, for example, of why Aristotle did understand that the world was round, and hundreds of years later, Lactantius, one of the church fathers, denied it. What was the reason why Lactantius denied it? Well, this is the sort of thing I think that makes history both rewarding and interesting. And certainly in the history of science, going back to the issue of uncertainty, we shouldn't hide the fact that our greatest heroes were wrong about things. Galileo had a completely cockeyed view of the tides. Newton miscalculated the speed of sound. There are many of these episodes, and these are very important as part of the teaching of science, to teach how gradually we've come out of a long sequence of errors which we're not yet free of.
Oh, I just want to move a little further. I think what you're saying is absolutely right about the importance in education of hearing that people perceive the world in so many different ways, and science can bring a way of really, critically thinking about it. But I wanted to, when you talked about communication, it got me thinking about how, the press and media and so forth do communicate a lot of science. And a lot of the stories we hear, are often driven by, well, it's a sensational story to sort of show up a controversy, rather than, well, what is the science? And I remember having a very impassioned discussion with somebody from one of the, big broadcasting companies whose stories had all been about some minor correspondence about climate change, which had been seized upon by the media as, oh, well, even the scientists don't believe climate change. And I thought that was a real abrogation of responsibility by the media, in this case, to have not said, well, this is what we know about the changing climate situation, and focused purely on something that would, do everything that would undermine it to somebody who was not well enough versed. Now, this was a few years ago, but I think it was very important because the media are so important in we call it balanced coverage, but what we hear as, quote, balanced coverage is a little bit like the flat earth classes we were talking about, which is, well, no, they're not balanced, actually, and yet they're presented that way. So I think back to our responsibility as scientists, that's where we just have to keep on saying, look, yes, we get there are complexities, we get there are uncertainties, but here is the weight of what we do know, and that's the best guide to how we can proceed, not only, equally taking into account the counter arguments, which as scientists we all listen to, because as scientists we're always criticizing every idea. So we get this, but we also have to understand how we, not understand, but help that you also weigh the evidence against a lot of different criteria. So I'm just saying the media are so important in how ideas are sort of spread about the value of science, and we as scientists constantly have to keep on actively engaging with the media and speaking publicly when we can and comprehensively when we can.
Yeah, presumably the responsibility to speak yourselves as scientists is a very strong one, because you can't really rely on the media to tell the story properly. I mean, you can hope, but it's only really scientists who can tell it like they understand it, surely.
Yeah, yes, I think that's what I'm saying. So I do agree to give talks because I think when I look at the misinformation that spreads around about my field, I think, well, I'd better get in there and give some talks and talk about, among other things, of course, the statistical uncertainties about what we do and don't know about my particular area of science, but what we do know as well as what we can only be very limited in what we say.
There are science reporters who do a very responsible, intelligent job of reporting on science. And I think they're hampered by the fact that the newspapers themselves, the publishers, don't feel, and probably correctly, don't feel the public have the kind of intense interest in science that they have in sports or business. I know we had a very good science reporter here in Texas, and he was fired, not because he wasn't a good science reporter, but because the newspaper simply decided they didn't want to bother having a science reporter. It just wasn't that interesting to their readers. I think we have to keep trying. And one thing, of course, you don't have to rely on the press. You can write books yourself and even make some money at it.
Bob, please.
Yeah, you know, as I'm listening, it's the dealing with the uncertainty, which is difficult to communicate. I mean, there's a large part of the population who based on religious backgrounds and stuff, expect things to be certain, expect there to be answers to things, and trying to communicate the ideas that we believe and we operate and we function, but we don't understand everything. And we build a model and we work from there, and then we correct it as we go. And sort of trying to get people to understand that, I think, is the difficult part. I think, for example, you know, the vaccine is, and the resistance to it is an example of, you know, here's a case. We don't know everything, but I think we know enough to know that the odds are really, really good that we should do this. But it's very easy to find a bit of uncertainty and build on that and try to turn that into something that's it's really not. So I think that's what we need to communicate as scientists is how you function in a world which is not certain.
Yes, and we proceed by hunches. That's a large part of our armamentarium is to have the right guesswork, but always with methods of verification waiting to be used to see whether our guesses are leading us in the right direction.
So education is really a complicated thing at this point because you have two goals. One is you want to educate students that are learning, us also, about the truth. And the other is you want to educate students about how to proceed in an arena where all sorts of information is coming out there, and you have to be able to make decisions based on that. You have to have hunches, you know, and that sometimes one will be wrong. That can have consequences. But how do you make decisions based on information that comes at you from various directions? And that's a really challenging thing. I'm not sure we're good at the science. I'm not sure we're good at even at the educating about science yet. But I think paying attention to both aspects is really critical. We do want to tell people what we know. That's important to pass on. We want to tell people how do you get there, and that's also important to pass on.
Yeah, that ability to think critically is a difficult thing to teach. Andy, I think in the opening panel discussion, you touched upon the idea that there are very few people with scientific training in positions of public authority in politics, for instance. How important do you think it is that that changes, that scientists listening to this, perhaps young people studying science and maybe doing their doctorates, but then go out and try and enter different spheres and, if you like, spread the word?
I mean, I think that's critical. I mean, the other way to look at it is everybody is going to need to have their own scientific armamentarium, their own scientific training, their own scientific critical aspects, no matter what they're doing. And I think that anybody in university, no matter what they're going to go forward with, there are science requirements. There have been for a long time. It's really important to do that, and that will be part of somebody who's in a political leadership position, but also somebody who's in a different kind of leadership position. If someone is teaching at any level, if someone is managing a business, if someone is working in a business and making decisions there, that will all have to be done based on scientific input, scientific hunches, as Stephen put it. And I think that we don't quite know how to do that training yet, but we should be working on it.
And I, at the risk of repeating myself, I think emphasizing the history of science in everything we teach, in every course we teach, teaching the history of the development of our present knowledge is invaluable. Our students can't by themselves, even though we give them a PhD thesis to work on, they can't by themselves experience, recapitulate the whole history of this wonderful enterprise. It's a great project that mankind has been involved in for millennia, and teaching the history as part of our teaching physics not only allows the students to get the kind of experience that Andy was referring to, but also to appreciate how wonderful it is. What a great story this is.
Maths at the same time.
And
Find out the uses of that.
And for instance, I wouldn't teach a course in mathematics without describing the history of the scientific problems that gave rise to that mathematics. But this is perhaps a pet enthusiasm of mine, the history of science.
Speaking of history, I'm thinking of a historical figure, Marie Curie, and she said something that I love. She said, "Nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood." And I think that speaks to this whole sort of thing about being human, which is we live in a terrifying world, right? And so when you can bring science to help you understand things, it goes some way to understanding and losing some of the fear. When somebody feels terribly ill, and then you can understand what your illness is about because of the modern science that has played into what we now know as, modern medicine. That takes away a lot of fear as well. So I think that science, it's been this whole sort of evolution, as Stephen was saying, from living in a fearful world that we didn't understand to more and more being able to understand it and not having so much fear, because science has been able to help us understand so much, and also to understand what we don't yet know.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. It's been a beautiful discussion. We're going over time, but I just wanted to finish with the students, because this whole program is dedicated to the students. So if you had to give advice to the young people watching about how they should, support science, support people's a general understanding of the value of science, what would you say that people should do? Very briefly, let's just go through. Liz.
Stay curious.
That was wonderfully succinct. Bob.
Be lucky and hope you find things that you're excited about.
Andy?
Listen.
Can't get more succinct than that. And Stephen, last word to you, please.
Don't wait for the education to be poured into you. Go out and get it yourself. Read books. Think about things yourself. Your teachers are doing the best they can, but they can't do it all.
Thank you so much. That was a beautifully inspiring way to finish 2 days of an inspiration initiative. I'm very grateful to you all for being here, and also to the audience for being with us over the last 2 days. Thank you all for listening. And now it's just my pleasure to pass over to 3 people: David Vanden Bout from UT, Denise Rutherford from 3M, and Lara Spreckmann from Nobel Prize Outreach, to have a short conversation to close the whole event. Thank you all.